nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decompositions? God too decompose. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here, the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last, he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. My time is not yet. An interesting piece of writing, clearly. And there are a couple things I want to pull out of this parable and talk about quickly. And the first thing I will notice is this, or ask you to notice is this. Who is it that the madman's talking to? Who is he confronting in the parable? The unbelievers in God, right? The atheists. Yeah. Keep in mind that in this parable, he is confronting and taking on the atheists. And he's saying to them, you don't get it. You don't understand what's happening here. So in the parable, the madman is, and Nietzsche is doing this with his contemporaries, his intellectual contemporaries. He's saying to the atheists of his day, you haven't figured this out yet. You don't get what's really going on here. Second thing I want you, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The second thing I want you to notice here is that Nietzsche in this parable never says there is no God or God doesn't exist. That's not what he says, right? He says God is dead. God is dead and we have killed him. We are his murderers, is what he says in this parable. And that's significant. Because when he says God is dead, he's not making a theological declaration here. He's not talking about some super sensible, transcendent being. He's not talking about a divine person. That's not what this is about. He's not talking about a person named God. Instead, his claim that God is dead is a cultural observation. It's something he's observing about his own society. Nietzsche believes that his society has rejected the former paradigm or narrative, story, if you will, and is replacing the old story with a new story. We had for centuries this story that we've been developing and talking about. And this story has been wrapped around the notion of God. Although the story actually begins with the ancient Greeks, with Socrates. And we have been continually adding to and filling out this story. God here, when he says God is dead, doesn't refer to a being. It refers to the Judeo-Christian Islamic story or narrative and everything that that narrative entails. When he says, we have killed God, what he means is we have decided not to accept that story anymore. We don't believe in that story. At least he wants to say his contemporary atheists don't believe in the God story anymore. They want to change the story. They want to change the narrative. So Nietzsche thinks that his contemporaries, and you have to understand in the late 19th century, atheism has sort of taken hold in Western Europe. There are these atheists there in Western Europe. And when he says when we have killed God, he means that we have rejected this narrative. It's not about God. It's much bigger than all of that. It's about everything that we have said about the world and ourselves, yes, and God too. And he says we've done away with that narrative. We don't find that narrative persuasive anymore. That story doesn't work for us. We have outgrown the story, if you will. It no longer compels us. We don't find it a compelling story. And so he talks about the death of God. He talks about, you remember he talks about wiping away the horizon. The horizon is that thing that helps us orient ourselves. Based on the horizon, we figure out what's left and right, what's up and down. He talks about unchaining the earth from the sun, and now we're hurtling through space. Is there any up or down left? If you wipe away the story that we've used to make meaning out of the meaninglessness, then we are back into meaninglessness again, right? And so he's saying we have done away with this story. We have done away with this narrative about God and about all that God entails. We don't, as he puts it here, we don't believe that story anymore. It's become for us, again, anachronistic. It seems to no longer compel us. And now we need to replace it with a new story. We have to come up with a different story to make meaning out of the meaninglessness. Here's a sort of parallel idea about what he's talking about. And please understand, this is not Nietzsche. This is me trying to explain what's happening here with Nietzsche, okay? But it seems to me it's a lot like the Santa Claus narrative. When you're a young child, you're told this story, at least many of us are told this story about Santa Claus, who is constantly watching us. And if we're good little girls and boys, Santa Claus will bring us presents on Christmas. And if we're, or not you, Roger, because bad little girls and boys, like Roger, get coal in their stocking rather than presents, right? And as a child, here's the thing: as a child, you find this story very compelling, right? You constantly say, "Oh, Santa's watching. I've got to be careful," and you live your life according to this story because you find this story very compelling. You leave out milk and cookies for Santa Claus. And you come down on Christmas Day and your stocking is filled with goodies. There's presents under the tree. The milk and cookies are gone, and maybe Santa's left you a little note thanking you for that, right? And you're persuaded that it's true. As you begin to mature, you begin to say, wait a minute. How does this dude make it all the way around the globe and give toys to all the little girls and boys? How is that possible? How can he come down in my chimney when I don't have a fireplace? I got a furnace in the basement. This just doesn't make sense, right? And you begin to wonder about it. And then eventually you decide, you know what? This story isn't working for me anymore, right? I don't find this compelling. And you come up with a different story. Mom and Dad are buying the presents. They're drinking the milk and cookies and leaving me the note and all of that, right? You have outgrown the story, the narrative. You don't find that compelling anymore. This is exactly what Nietzsche thinks has happened in the late 19th century. there's this story that we've been talking about for centuries and centuries. And we've wrapped the story around God. Now we find the story out of date. We no longer find it compelling. We think there's a different story. In fact, it becomes a scientific story. Science is going to tell us how we got here and why we're here and what's happening and what have you. When he says, God is dead and we have killed him, we are his murderers, what he means is we have moved past this narrative that we've been telling for so long, and we've replaced it with a new story because we don't find the old story compelling any longer. So we have to move on. And he thinks that this is what the atheists of his day were sort of up to. Let me stop here for just a second. How are we doing? Any questions or concerns or comments about any of that, what we've talked about so far? Yeah.
Why does he break the lantern?
I'm sorry?
Why does he break the lantern?
Oh, why does he break the lantern? Good question. Because
Can you repeat the question?
why does he break the lantern at the end of the story?
Great.
And that's because he gets frustrated with his contemporary atheists because he thinks they don't understand what's really going on here. He talks about the corpse of God decomposing, right? It's beginning to smell bad because this corpse is lying out here on the ground, right? And he's running with this metaphor. He's saying the problem is you've rejected God, but you're hanging on to parts of the story that you need to let go of. And that's why he breaks the lantern. Out of frustration, he says, I'm here too soon. You guys don't get what's really going on here. You want to hang on to, and understand, he's attacking his atheist friends. He's saying, you want to hang on to bits of the story that you said you don't believe in anymore. You don't believe in God, but you want to hang on to pieces of the story. And as he puts it, the corpse is beginning to smell pretty bad because you're holding on to things that are part of the God story, and you need to give those up. He's trying to get them to give up those things. In fact, that's what Twilight of the Idols is all about. We'll talk about that in just a minute.
He doesn't think he's early in his time, that someday man will realize he's right.
Yep. He's assuming that eventually they'll catch on to what's going on. Yeah, they want to say God doesn't exist, but they want to hold on to all these pieces. It's like leaving out the milk and cookies even though you don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. It's like, that's silly, right? Because you don't believe in this story. And there are things about Christianity and about the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition that they still want to hold on to. We'll talk about those. Because they like them. And he's going to say, no, you've got to jettison all of that. It's got to go. And that's why, out of frustration, he throws down the lantern and says, you don't get it. I'm too early. They'll eventually get it, but you haven't figured it out yet, is what he's saying. Yeah. Yeah.
So they're killing God, or they killed God, but God is dead. That means he must have existed, or was it only in people's minds that they think God existed at one time? Because if he's dead, he had to have been alive.
Understand that by God, he doesn't mean a person or a being. He means this story that we've told.
Yes, like Santa Claus.
Right.
Okay. But Santa Claus really never, same scenario then. He never really existed, Santa Claus.
Well,
Nicholas did.
I know. But he didn't ever bring me anything.
You must not have been a good little girl.
It depends on whether you find the story compelling. Okay. My granddaughter absolutely believes that the elf on the shelf is going to take information to Santa Claus about her. And she talks to the elf on the shelf saying, I would really like, of course, here's the question. Is any of this true? Now, what Nietzsche wants to say is this, well, let's move on. I'll answer your question, okay? I promise. So, he's saying here Western society has rejected the old paradigm, rejected the old story, doesn't believe it anymore, and has replaced it with a new story, a different story, a story about science. Keep in mind that Darwin publishes The Origin of Species about 1859, I think it is. Nietzsche's writing this here in 83 is when he writes, or maybe it's 88, when he writes the Twilight of the Idols. So there's this whole new exciting story about evolution and how we got here and how we explain the origins of everything. And we're replacing the old God story with a different story. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche wants to say, and probably I guess we could say his greatest contribution to contemporary thought, is that there is no what we would call a meta-narrative. That is to say, there is no ultimate true story. Nietzsche thinks we simply have different stories. We find them compelling for a while, then we find them no longer compelling, and we replace the story with a different story. But there is no ultimate or true story. And philosophy had spent all of its time looking for the right story. How do we account for truth? What is the true nature of everything? This is what philosophy has been wrestling with. And what Nietzsche says is, there is no true story. It's all meaningless. So we have to impose a story to give meaning, to impose meaning on what's otherwise meaningless. So we went with this God story for a while. Now we've outgrown it, like the Santa Claus narrative. And so now we want a new story. And now we find this scientific story compelling. But understand this, Nietzsche says, that story will also run its course, and we will no longer find that story compelling. And we'll replace it with another story. Because there is no ultimate true story. There is no meta-narrative, some ultimate narrative. There isn't. There are just these stories, and every story will eventually be replaced. That's what he thinks. Every story goes out of date. And quite frankly, right now, we're sort of on the cusp of giving up the scientific story. It's got too many holes, too many cracks, too many things that it doesn't explain to us. And more, we're moving away from the science story. We don't find it compelling anymore. And this is precisely what Nietzsche thinks will happen, that every story is going to eventually run its course and be replaced. This is called perspectivism. Nietzsche's a perspectivist because he thinks that truth is grounded in the perspective of the narrative. That is, what's true, and this goes to your question. Did God exist? Sure. If that God story's true, then yes, God exists. Does Santa Claus exist? Yes. If the Santa Claus story is compelling for you, then yes. But once you give up that story, now you're going to have to come up with a different explanation or a different account. And so if you believe the scientific story now, then God doesn't exist. God never existed. It depends upon what perspective you have with regards to these stories. Again, how are we doing here? Let's stop for just a moment. I know we're covering a lot of heavy stuff here. But this is what Nietzsche thinks is going on. And he thinks his contemporary atheists have rejected part of the God story, but again, they want to hold on to other parts of the story. And he's saying, you're going to have to give those up. You've got to relinquish all the parts of the story. Yeah.
Can you give some ideas of what these other parts are?
Yep, we're going to do that in just a minute. Thank you very much. I'll pay you later. Because, yes, because that's what Twilight of the Idols is all about. He writes this book called Twilight of the Idols, and in it, he wants to talk about how the atheists haven't given up all the pieces of the story yet. In fact, the title is actually Twilight of the Idols, and the subtitle is How to Philosophize with a Hammer. That's the subtitle. By the way, he wrote this very quickly. It's estimated that he probably wrote it within about 1 week. And he's using the word idols here to refer to the quote-unquote truths of the God paradigm or the God narrative. He wants to look at the truths, and again, I want to put that in parentheses, because it's the truths based on this story, but now looked at through the eyes of a different story, the science story. And he says, I'm going to take a hammer, and I'm going to tap on, he talks about this in the preface, I'm going to tap on these idols and listen. If they ring true, then I'll keep them. But if they ring hollow, I'm going to take that hammer, I'm going to smash them. Because that's what we need to do. We need to do away with all of these idols that no longer belong. So he's philosophizing with a hammer. He's going to rap on these idols. He's, of course, speaking metaphorically, right? He's going to listen to whether or not these things make sense, or whether they're consistent with the story, the new story. And if they're inconsistent with the story, we're going to smash them to pieces because they no longer belong. And that's what he means by philosophizing with a hammer. All right. So, by the way, he gets the title from his good friend, Richard Wagner. Wagner wrote Twilight of the Gods, the opera, Twilight of the Gods. And Twilight of the Gods is based upon Norse mythology, where the old gods are killed and a new reality is created. And he's playing on that same idea. We're going to do away with the old story and the old world, and we're going to replace it with a new one by examining the idols that were part of the old story. So he's going to test the truths of the God narrative. Here we go. Truth number one that he wants to examine is this: appearance versus reality. Well, that's odd. Philosophy has talked from way long ago. Plato introduced this idea fundamentally, that there are things that appear to us and we think are real, and then there's the real stuff, the true stuff. And the true stuff is the stuff that Plato says is perfect and eternal and endures forever. Being versus becoming. What's true endures and never changes. What what is appearance is constantly changing, and so is always becoming. And for Plato, and Nietzsche thinks this gets wrapped up into the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, what's true, God, for example, is eternal and perfect and unchanging, right? That's part of this notion of appearance versus reality. So this truth that what's real endures and never changes, and what does change is not truly real, it's just appearance, is a concept that many still want to hold on to. Here's what he says. This is from page 17 of Twilight of the Idols. He says, reason, and notice he uses these single quotes all the time. He's talking about, this is what the God story says. This is all part of this God story. And the God story says, reason is what causes us to falsify the evidence of the senses. Don't trust your senses. If the senses show becoming, passing away, change, they do not lie. Heraclitus will always be right that being is an empty fiction. The apparent world is the only one. The real world has just been lied on. What he wants to say is, what he's saying here is, look, this distinction doesn't make sense anymore. The only world that's out there is this physical world that's becoming, that's changing all the time. And the idea of another reality that's perfect and unchanging and eternal, that's a lie, is what he's trying to say. Get your hammer out, start smashing. Because this idea of appearance versus reality doesn't work in the scientific story. Science says this is what's real right here, and there's nothing more. Just this. How are we doing? He goes on to say this. The real world, an idea with no further use, no longer even an obligation, an idea become useless, superfluous, therefore a refuted idea. Let us do away with it. Let's stop talking about some reality out there which transcends the physical world. Again, that's a lie. And notice what he says here, because it's very different from what all the other philosophers have said. He says, it's no longer useful to us. Therefore, it's refuted. In the past, philosophy would say, it's irrational, or it's contradictory. Therefore, it's refuted. Nietzsche doesn't say that. He simply says, we don't find it compelling anymore. It doesn't work for us anymore. So let's get rid of it. We don't need it. It's been refuted because we no longer find it compelling. How are we doing? I want to stop here for just a moment.
Yeah, it sounds like you gave the example of the river in the beginning.
Yes.
Well, it does change, but the river's still there.
Well, yeah.
He's saying, does philosophy accept what he's saying? This sounds almost like this is passé.
Oh my gosh. The contemporary world is full of these ideas right now. Trust me. He's one. He was right when he said, I came too soon. Others will get it. Our world is almost completely governed by this sort of postmodern way of thinking. This is what postmodernism is. It's built on this idea that there is no meta-narrative. And nowadays, it's always, here's my truth. Listen to my truth, right? Not the truth, but listen to what I think the truth is. Trust me, Nietzsche's won this battle, I think, at least in Western culture. He's sort of was right that people were going to sort of buy into this idea. So he's trying to get his contemporary intellectual atheist friends to see, look, you might like this idea of appearance versus reality because it's been so predominant, but it's time to give that up. It's milk and cookies for Santa Claus, and Santa Claus is dead. That is to say, this story is dead, and it's time to bury the corpse, as he puts it. Let's try another one. Human free will. Are we free human beings? The God story is, yes, God made us to be free, right? That's the God story. Science story is very different. He says this, the inner world, and by inner world he means what's going on in the mind, what the mind is thinking and doing. The inner world is full of jack-o'-lanterns. The will is one of them. The will no longer moves anything and therefore no longer explains anything either. It simply accompanies events and can even be absent. He says the notion of free will no longer makes any sense. That was part of the God narrative, but it's not part of the scientific narrative. Science tells us something completely different. That modern psychology, and I may be stepping into areas I don't belong, but modern psychology tells us that we're driven by subconscious forces. At least Freud says, there are these subconscious drives that actually explain why we do what we do, and we're not even aware of what's going on. It's going on subterranean. It's all happening under the surface. Science says that the world is made up of matter, the material world, and the matter is completely governed by mechanistic laws. There are laws of cause and effects, and every piece of matter is governed by those mechanistic laws, including the matter that makes up your brain. And what you think is your will, I will to raise my hand, was really determined by mechanistic laws that I had no control over. There is no such thing as free will. We no longer have, and again, Nietzsche speaking here now, we no longer have any sympathy nowadays for the concept of quote unquote free will. We know only too well what it is, the most disreputable piece of trickery the theologians have produced. The priests wanted to give themselves the right to impose punishments, or give God the right to do so. People were thought of as free, quote unquote, so that they could be judged and punished, so that they could become guilty. It's those damn theologians who want to punish us. He says, this no longer makes sense. According to science, there is no such thing as free will. Get your hammer out, smash that idol, because it no longer rings true. Under the scientific story, there is no free will. So he's done away with the idea of a transcendent reality. He said we got to do away with that. We got to do away with the idea that human beings somehow have free will. That doesn't make sense under our new scientific story either. Number 3, and it's sort of tied to human free will, is the idea that somehow we are that human beings are responsible for their behavior, and that we can develop morally into better and better people. The idea of human responsibility. are humans to be held responsible, morally accountable, if you will, for their actions. And here's what he says. Throughout the ages, people have wanted to, again, quote unquote, improve humanity, make us better people. This, above all, is what has been called morality. But under the same word, the most extraordinary variety of tendencies is hiding. Both the taming of the beast man and the breeding of a particular species of man have been called improvement. To call the taming of an animal its improvement is to our ears almost a joke. Anyone who knows what goes on in menageries or zoos will doubt that a beast is improved there. It is weakened, it is made less harmful, it is turned into a diseased beast through the depressive emotion of fear, through pain, through wounding, through hunger. He says, this idea of moral improvement, that's just foolishness. What we're trying to do is control people. And he says, we need to recognize that morality doesn't improve us, it just weakens us. That's what the scientific story tells us. That we need to rise to the top, right? You have survival of the fittest, and the fittest are the strongest and most powerful, and that use their power for their benefit. That's the story that the scientific story is these days. So once again, let's get our hammer, let's smash this idol too, that somehow we need to be moral, and that morality is somehow going to improve us. He goes, that no longer fits our narrative. Yes?
I'm confused with this one. Morality, I'm thinking control is more what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's correct.
I mean, we need to be moral.
Well,
I'm sorry.
he's going to say, not if you accept the scientific narrative, because the scientific narrative, think Darwin here, right? And the fact that we have to adapt and that we have to live long enough to reproduce and pass along our genetic material. This is what Darwin says is going on. And there's this constant battle in nature for the well-adapted and the powerful to survive. What morality does is it makes us weak, and it prevents us then from exercising the strength and power that we have and should use to pass along our genetic material. Right? It's all about survival, according to Darwin. It's not about being good. It's not about getting along. It's about rising to the top and using our power to our benefit. That's what he says. That's what the scientific story is all about. And he's sort of saying to his contemporaries, morality, that's part of that old story. That's part of the decomposing corpse. A lot of atheists want to hold on to the idea of morality. And he says, you got to give that up, because that's part of a story that you no longer accept. That's what he's talking about. Yes?
Is it possible to incorporate some of these ideas, like for example, in the issue of like drug addiction, how in some ways he was right that people originally moralized it as just a failing of being strong enough for free will, but it does have physical components that you have to take into account in the modern day.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the part of the reason why we find any narrative compelling is because there are elements of truth in it for us, right? I mean, we say, yeah, there's a a certain amount of truth in this idea that we don't really have control over things that happen to us sometimes. You know, that in the case of addiction, for example, as you were talking about, there's that element of how much control do I really have over these addictions. And we oftentimes, blame the victim for not exercising enough self-control over those kinds of things, right? And so it's on the basis of that we begin to buy into a particular story and say, well, that story makes a lot of sense to me. And I think what you're describing there is exactly what happens when he says we find the story compelling, or we begin to no longer find the story compelling, right? The story doesn't work for us at a certain point any longer. And he thinks, again, that his contemporaries have jettisoned God, but they're holding on to all these other pieces of the God story. And now he's trying to say you got to divest yourself of all of those pieces. And among those, he thinks, is the idea of human accountability, human morality. He says, that's something you simply have to now do away with. Now we have to struggle to survive, and we've got to try to get to the top of the heap, because that's how we survive. That's how we pass along our genetic material. Human equality, the fact that human beings are all equal, or what's sometimes called egalitarianism, that every human being is equal. This is one of those idols from the God story, and this is one that the atheists want to hang on to. Well, we're all equal. We ought to be treated equally. Nietzsche says this: Christianity is the revaluation of all Aryan values. Aryan values here, he's talking about India and their caste system. In the caste system, you had the superior people and the inferior people. Right? And he goes, Christianity's trying to rewrite this. The triumph of Chandala values. The Chandala were the lowest caste in the caste system. They were known as the untouchables, right? Those were the inferior people. The gospel preached to the poor and the lowly, the total revolt of everything downtrodden, miserable, ill-gotten, botched, against pedigree. The immortal revenge of the Chandala as religion of love. He says, look, Christianity wanted to change everything and said, we're all equal. We all to be treated equally and loved. And he goes, that just doesn't make any sense. Because evolution tells us some people are genetically superior and some people are genetically inferior. And that's the scientific story right now. So the idea that somehow we're all equal, that just is, rings hollow when we tap it. We need to smash that one too. That's got to go. And you know what? He's right about that. If it's simply evolution, then some people are genetically superior and some people are genetically inferior. It's that simple, if that's what it comes to. One more, and this one may surprise you. Cause and effect. The idea of causation, that one thing causes another, he says, is a product of belief in God and the God story. And if you don't believe in God, then you're going to have to give up causation. I'm not going to read it because we're running out of time. But basically what it says is this. The idea that things are caused is a result of our observing, willing something, I will to raise my hand, and that happening. And then we say, God does the same thing in reality. God wills certain things, and then they come to be. One ball strikes another and makes the other ball go off. that's quote unquote God's will. You do away with God, you do away with all of that. We don't ever encounter causation. We just encounter the effects of causation. He says it's time to do away with causation as well. Here are the idols of the God narrative. Appearance versus reality, human free will, human morality, human equality, and causation. He says, smash all those idols. Get rid of all of them. Here's my question for you today. Do you really want to get rid of all those things? Can we just simply wipe those away? In rejecting God's existence, like accepting God's existence, it costs you something. And what Nietzsche's saying is, here's the cost. Are you willing to pay this? And my answer is, no, I'm not willing to give all this stuff up. In some ways, Nietzsche gives us one of the most powerful arguments for theism that we can encounter, ironically, because he shows us if you're going to give up God, you're going to have to give up all that too. And the question is, do we really want to give up all these ideas? Or do we want to say there's something wrong with the news story that we're buying into? It seems to me that Nietzsche's telling his contemporaries, you got to smash these idols because they no longer work with your story. And for me, it becomes a powerful argument for holding on to the God narrative and saying, no, the God narrative makes more sense, is more compelling, if you will, for me than that scientific story. Because that scientific story is going to lead to the denial of all of this. And for me, that's too costly. I won't accept that, if you will. How are we doing? Let's take questions.
How about dealing with the Antichrist? It is his way of destroying Christianity as meta-narrative.
I'm not sure what you're asking me, Roger.
The Antichrist, the work by Nietzsche,
Yeah?
isn't he destroying Christianity as a meta-narrative?
Yes, he is. He's obviously hostile towards Christianity. Right? And here, he's sort of calling to task his contemporary atheists and saying, you know, you really haven't, as he puts it, buried the corpse yet. It's still sitting there rotting. And you got to get rid of all these things. Yeah.
But then are you saying that because Christianity is a meta-narrative, you buy it, not because it fits reality, but because it's appealing?
Well, if we say it's a narrative that I find appealing, yeah, then I'm sort of buying into this idea that there is no meta-narrative, right? And there's where I would take umbrage with Nietzsche and say, no, I do think there's a right narrative, a meta-narrative, and it's the one that talks about a divine being who's created this and has a plan for it. You want to follow up with something? Okay.
We have to say we believe in the meta-narrative, but we can't prove that it's reality.
No, we can't. I mean, I think we have to accept that fact. But then again, Nietzsche can't prove either that his notion of a narrative is the right one as well. Yes, Edith.
I guess my building on that is in responding, because so much of our culture has bought into this, for us to assert as Christians that there is a meta-narrative, that God exists, that there is a reality beyond to some extent, people will say, yeah, that's your truth and this is mine. Like, how would you suggest we respond or build on that to counter this message of it's all relative?
It's all based on the perspective, right? I think the best we can do is to perhaps point out, well, can you accept all of the implications of what this means? For example, can you accept the implications of this scientific story, which results in the denial of all these things that, at least for many of us, are extremely important? And hope, I guess, that somehow that would at least force them to stop and reflect whether or not they can sort of live with this, or if they're going to have to adjust their views. Yes, Kate.
I was going to say, I think in a way we're if we use this as our framework, essentially, to do it, we can encourage them to smash any of the scientific idols or whatever that don't coincide with what they believe should be.
Good. Yes,
morality.
I mean, here's the question. Which idol should we be smashing? Should we be smashing the idols from the God story, or should we be smashing the idols of the scientific story, right? And like you say, I find myself more inclined to smash the scientific idols rather than the God story idols, yes.
There's a theory that it's better to fertilize your lawn and take care of it than it is plow everything up and start from scratch.
Yeah, right.
And, I'm a firm believer that you can improve without taking a hammer to all this and starting from scratch.
Yeah. And of course, Nietzsche took a hammer, right? I mean, and he literally plowed everything up. And so we got to look at this completely differently. And here's the question. Do we really want to do that? Or do we want to hold on to what we think is truly important? And to me, these kinds of things are truly important. I prefer to smash the other idols, as you put it, Kate. Yes?
So as time moves on, is postmodernism smashing the idols of the scientific era?
Yes. I mean, ironically, that's a really good observation, Verna, that what's happening now is, and Nietzsche said, well, yeah, that was going to happen. You could expect that this story that was so compelling for the 19th century, by the time we get into the 21st century, we're finding ourselves going, oh, no, there's too many problems, there's too many cracks. Now, of course, what are we going to replace it with? We need another story, right? And so we're waiting sort of for that story to come about. What we haven't talked about is der Übermensch, which is the other thing that Nietzsche talks about. The people who create new stories is what he meant by that. These superhumans who will create new stories. Darwin was der Übermensch. He created a new story. By the way, Nietzsche says Christ was der Übermensch. Christ created a story, and we all followed it for a long time. Now we're waiting for a new story to emerge, and it hasn't come yet. But you're right. We're going to end up taking those idols from the scientific story, and we're going to smash those too and replace them with some other idols. Yeah. Roger?
Isn't postmodernism saying that there is no story?
Yes.
To be...
There's no ultimate story. There's no true story, right? There's no meta-narrative. They're just narratives. They're competing narratives. And again, we either find them compelling and go along with them, or we don't find them compelling and we don't go along with them. We really have to go. I'm sorry. We're way over time. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. Let's just end with a quick word of prayer. God, we are sometimes overwhelmed with what we encounter, but we know that you are a God who loves us and cares for us and who died and provides salvation for us. And we thank you for your love and constant care. And we pray these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much for your time together.
As you go, there's no Westminster for the next 2 weeks.
Yes.
Again, I just want to say thank you. This was awesome. And in 2 weeks, Jay Case will be back, and the topic will be materialism and Christianity.